In 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, it looks like we're live. Welcome everybody to this broadcast we have here live with you, Paul McCusker, Irene Chambers, and Melanie Dobson. And I'll introduce them in just a second. But first, let's make sure everything's working well as far as sound, video. If you can hear us, please just drop that in the chat so we make sure we're not speaking into thin air. So scanning. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Thank you, Writing Lark. We can hear you. I can hear you. Great. Good. So, and they can see us. Wonderful. Wonderful news. So we're also glad to be here with you. And this is a really special time because for once, you get to be part of this. Our speakers have prepared some great presentations, but finally you get to join the mix in sort of this giant round table. We're all going to talk about revisions and get your questions answered. So a bit about our panelists today. As I mentioned, Paul McCusker, he is author of many Adventures in Odyssey episodes, also of several novels and other pieces of fiction. We have Melanie Dobson, who is well known for writing time slip and historical fiction, if I got that right.
That's right.
Yes, and she'll need no introduction if you've been here in past years. I think it was 2 years ago you were here with us.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Right. So we're glad to have you back. And then Irene Chambers was kind of to join us. She is a professional editor, and we're really excited for what she brings to the table as we're talking about working with others, including editors, in your revisions process. So she'll have a lot to add to the discussion as well. So give them all a virtual round of applause and thank you. And let's dive in. As you may have seen in the chat, I requested that you mark your questions with an all cap question. So QUESTION, all of those are in all caps. And then we will get to that. In the meantime, there is one thing I wanted to bring up, and that is our sponsor for this entire summit. We're really grateful to the company for sponsoring us, and wanted to bring you the short message from the company. And we would encourage you to really check out their full summit page and look at some of the great offers they have to take you really deeper in this writing and revision journey. So the company, what about them? They offer training, resources, and events for writers in a supportive, Christ-centered community. You can check out all of their programs now at writers.company/storembers or visit their virtual booth for an exclusive offer just for summit attendees. The company's full-time writing apprenticeship is now enrolling this fall. Apply today. So, once again, go check that out. And it looks like we have our first question in. So this is from Tabitha Driver. Question is, how do you add subtext during revisions? This is a good one to kick us out. Start us out. I guess I'll field this to all of you just for a short response on what is the first thing that pops into your head as far as a technique used to add subtext during the revision process. So I'm going to go sort of counterclockwise on my screen. I'm going to start with you, Melanie, and then Irene, and then Paul.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
It might be a better one to answer that, the editor.
Okay. Yeah. Briefly, I'll just dig a little deeper. I think the question is about we've already gotten often the first draft is maybe a little wooden. We're trying to figure our ideas out, but we're not expressing them super well. So we already know what we want to say, but how are we going to say that in a more pleasing, subtle way where it's not all on the nose? So Melanie or Irene, if you would like to jump in, go right ahead.
All right, I'll jump in. Mm-hmm. So when you're trying to give subtle hints of something, I would suggest that you take it from your character's point of view, and in their POV, it's what they're thinking. So if you can put what you're trying to add in that character's POV, you're basically going to present what it is they're thinking about. You can use that still in third person for deep POV. And I think that can add some nuances of subtext as one thing you can do.
Yeah. Great advice. Paul, did you want to jump in?
Well, yeah. And the interesting thing for me in the revision process, which the revision process itself is dependent on what I'm revising to accomplish. In other words, I may write something and then I may have hopefully have an editor. And is this for a particular book company? Is this for a particular, it's an audio drama, it's something. It depends on who's getting it from me into the audience. And then they have a vested interest in terms of what I'm doing. And so the revision process sometimes has a dynamic to it that's dependent on one hand, there's the artistry, what it is that I was intending to do and discovering that about the project as I was writing it, that sort of thing. And then is it going to work for the audience? And looking for subtext, I mean, those sorts of things sometimes do emerge for me in the revision, that there are subtleties and there are things that in trying to get the thing written and my intentionality of that. And as I'm discovering a lot of things about character, about plots and all the things that I'm doing in the project, that the subtext often does emerge for me. And it's not an intentional, I need to figure out how to put more subtext in. For me in the revision process, especially with the hands of a good editor, the subtext begins to emerge. The subtleties begin to emerge even more because there are certain themes that I might have been a bit blinded to, some things that were happening that I wasn't aware of until either another set of eyes came on them and drew attention to them, or I got enough distance from the project to be able to look at it fresh, look at it maybe as my audience will be looking at it or hearing it or whatever, and then to be able to go back in. And often a good editor will point you in the direction of the subtext and how to build that up a bit in the terms of character or plot or certain things. Or I'll discover it myself. And then I'll realize, oh, I could shore this up a little bit more. Or this was a little too on the nose. I'm just going to pull that back or take it out. I don't even need it. I'm stating something that's obvious to the reader. And so I'm trying to hit it a little bit too hard so I can pull that back, cut that out. It's unnecessary now. And then I think the subtext sort of works its way up and becomes a little bit, in many ways, clearer, or at least clear in the subtle way that you want it to in any sort of good art.
Yeah, I can talk to that in regard to, are you getting an echo on me? I'm hearing myself twice.
There's a little bit of an echo.
Okay.
Perhaps try the headphones.
Yeah, I'm going to plug my mic here too.
I might try headphones myself. Let's see.
Is that better? Oh, no, it's not. All right, is that better?
I think so.
Okay, I'm still hearing myself twice. So, okay, so I revise by layer, and so when I get, sorry, guys.
It's all right. We'll work through it.
Hold it off and see if I can. Okay, can you hear me okay?
I think that's better now. Yeah, go for it.
Why don't you move on and I'll come back.
Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah, so we're getting some questions in here about really how to work relationally with some of the others involved in the writing project, like editors or critique partners or beta readers. And one of the first questions we got about that revolves around what if these people really don't like an important character in your story, which happens a lot, especially if the character has a big character arc from less likable to more likable. Um, if you're in the back of your head, you're thinking, well, it's going to change. It's going to change. Where's the balance between knowing that there has to be that character arc and then also listening to these editors and beta readers and such, who are telling you, hey, I really don't like this character. I'm not invested in them.
It's that, well, I'll just say something real quick that might help an overview as we answer this. And that is the credibility of the people who have input. I mean, I'm wary of somebody who just doesn't like something. That's like saying, I don't like the color purple or something like that. What does that mean? Credible voices that are out looking for the best interest of the project, when they can give you a meaningful, oh, well, here's what I thought of that character. I've written characters that people go, well, I didn't like the character. And I think, well, that's good because you weren't meant to, and so when somebody comes in with notes like that or a response, I want to tease out from them, at least before I begin to make changes or adjust. I want to go a little bit deeper in terms of what they're talking about. So it's not a capricious sort of decision. They don't like something just because they don't like it, but explain what it is that you don't like, or does that feel like a distraction? You've diverted over to this other character, and what I really care about is that character. So I don't understand why I'm with this second character at all, unless, of course, you've introduced something that it's going to intersect. There's something important in there. So first, it's who's doing the criticism. The second then is how do we respond to it? How do we process it so that we can be thinking in terms of our intention, but also, again, keeping that other eye on the audience. As a writer said, Taylor Sheridan has said, the audience should never be asking what happened. They should always be asking what's going to happen. And so if I'm confusing them by something, if I've created a character that seems like a distraction, I can process all of that fairly and dispassionately, I hope, and not dig in. I mean, I take all criticism as valid, in the sense that I want to work through, if they felt this way or they thought this, then a lot of other people may feel that way as well. So I need to go back and double check what I was trying to do, and did I actually do it? And does it fit? I mean, I've written a novel where I had an editor who came back, and I wound up cutting like 35,000 words out of this novel, because a lot of what was cut out of it was not essential, and that included some secondary characters and things. And the editor was right. It would have been a distraction for me to have kept it in. It would have taken our attention off the most important things. And it was an absolute right thing to do. I've never been tempted to put it back in if I could republish it or whatever for that reason.
Yeah, to echo what Paul said, it's impossible to please everybody. They're not going to like all of our characters. And liking a character is not necessarily something I endeavor to do unless it's my hero, of course. But I want my character to be interesting, and I want my readers to be able to identify in some way with my characters, and I want them to be sympathetic or empathetic. So I want my characters to be able to relate to them. And so it's a different approach. But I revise in layers. And so I will look at my themes, my characters, my setting. I look at all that in layers. And if several of my favorite readers say they don't like a specific character and why, I will absolutely go back and look at that and see what it is that they're not liking. If it's something they have a choice to make, if it's something necessary for them to do, or if it's just they're not like a my character.
I agree. Both of you guys had really good points. The thing to me is, I, as an editor, I'm going to let you know what my advice is. It's not just, like Paul said, I don't like this. It's why. So you do want to pull out why. The person who's giving you advice hopefully might have suggestions, especially if it's your editor. You could try this or you could try that. And then Melanie's point of the layers of a story, you know how you put it together, you know where you want to go with it. So taking the revision feedback, you can meld those two together. So you've got what someone else is looking at and what you were trying to do, but you're also looking at how it affects the other elements of your story. So I think it's great to take the advice, but you're the author and you know what you want to do with that advice. So you're always the last stop on that.
Well, thank you. So I want to dive into something a little bit related, especially going off what you said, Paul, about really dive into why readers are saying what they're saying or editors are saying what they're saying. And so a lot of times readers ask us questions or give us feedback. But what are some questions you will ask your editors, readers, critique partners that are really helpful for you? And then Irene, I have want to flip this question around. What are questions you love to receive from authors as an editor, or maybe some ones that are not very helpful that you've received?
Well, for me, the obvious thing that I'm asking is it working? Is this thing actually working? And again, usually when you're dealing with an editor, the editor, if the editor is working for a particular company, for example, their job in part is not only to help to bring the best out of us in our writing, but to make sure it's palatable and works for the audience. Otherwise, people are going to lose money. It's not going to sell. You're trying to give this book or whatever it may be every opportunity to work. That's a big thing that editors bring to the table, not just creating and mastering the artistry and making sure that it is what it ought to be, but that it's palatable and going to work for the audience. And at the point where it doesn't matter how clever I think I am, my question to the editor when I hand something over is, presumably we've talked before anyway in terms of what the project is, what I'm trying to do, what they think it is that I'm trying to do. And then I'm going to ask the question, is it working? Is it firing on all cylinders? Are the characters ringing true? Is the story ringing true? The dialogue, every aspect of it, is that to me is vital. Because if I'm I don't care how clever I think I am. If I'm misfiring, I need somebody that's going to tell me that I'm misfiring and why, or at least, if not the why, but at least make suggestions or represent, the other point of view. So honestly, is it working is probably the singular biggest question I'm ever going to ask.
So when you send your manuscript off to other people, you're not just dumping a laugh and saying, hey, give me feedback, but you want to communicate to them what it should look like if it's working, and then they can tell you if it does look like that.
Well, it's both, because an editor, presumably, if you're going through the business of the publishing, the editor is already going to know because the book's been approved to be published.
Sure.
So you got a bit of a head start there. There is value if I'm going to hand off to a trusted reader, whoever that may be, someone I trust to give me solid feedback and credible feedback. Then, I mean, there's something to be said for letting them just experiencing it without knowing. I mean, I most often like to watch movies without knowing anything about them so that I can assess what's going on and engage in the movie without any preconceived notions. So both are valuable, but it still comes back to the end of it. Did it work? Mm-hmm. Did it move you? What did you get out of this? I mean, if they're reading it blindly, so to speak, in terms of no prep, then those questions go into, well, what do I mean by work? Well, yeah, was it moving where it was supposed to be? Did it entertain you? Was it a compelling story? Were the characters believable? All of the subset questions that are important to the overall, did it work?
Yeah, I love that. I have a first reader. I have a critique group. I should back up and say that meets once a month. We come to my house. Actually, I host it, and we've been around for 15 years. So we've been together for a while, and some of the faces have changed over the years, but it's been really consistent. And so we read about 15 to 20 pages of each other's work each month, and we just verbally critique it. We also make notes, but then we can brainstorm, and it's really fun because back to the question about likability of characters, it's really fun to have a community of 6 different people, 6 readers / writers in the room, and you go back and forth and you can debate. And sometimes we really debate. Somebody really likes a character, somebody really doesn't, and then you can hear in real time what they like or don't like, or what's believable or what's not believable. And so that's been really helpful for me. But then I also have a first reader, and she's been my first reader since I began writing fiction from the very beginning. And so she knows my style, and I still do. I ask her a few questions, kind of like what Paul said, is this working? But it's like, is it believable? Are there any places where it's slow, where you want to put the story down? Please mark those. If there are any places that cease to be interesting, I want to know that. And I also want to know, is it engaging? Does it engage you? Do you want to keep reading? Do you want to find out what happens next? Because the second that you don't care anymore about the characters or the story, then that's the point that I have to go in and really work at it. And so that's really important to me, especially since I write this time slip fiction. So I write stories that are past and present. And so I have 2 separate timelines going on, and I'm weaving these 2 stories together. And there's so many places where it could break and either not be engaging, or I tell too much information, or there's not enough information. And so I work really closely with my first reader, and then eventually with my editors, in order to make sure that I'm revealing information at the correct time, the story continues to be engaging, and that readers still want to continue following along in the plot.
That is a great system. So Irene, what are some questions you like to receive from authors?
The questions I most want is, it's actually more than just a question. If people will tell me what their goal is, what their characters, are meant to be, if they tell me the information that they're trying to put forth, then I'm better able to decide whether they've done that. So more than questions, it's letting me know what their intent is, where they're going with it, what they intend.
Gotcha. So if you're working with an editor, now you know. And we actually have a question here specifically for you, Irene. It is, where is it? Oh, yes. As an editor, when you receive a manuscript, what things do you expect to have already been fixed by the writer on their own?
It depends on what they're asking me to do. If they're asking for copy editing and it has clearly not been through a substantive edit, then I would have expected substantive items to have already been taken care of. The plot arc, the character arc, those things would need to have been done. If they're coming to me and they honestly don't have a lot of fiction techniques that they are comfortable being able to do, then it's not ready for the substantive edit. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. When people don't have a lot of fiction techniques under their belt, then some editors will offer mentoring to go through what they've written. So it's kind of, I have to look at it to see at what point their manuscript is, and then I'll know better what to recommend. If someone is asking for something they're not actually ready for, then that's the point where getting them ready for it comes in.
Gotcha. So you might even get some feedback of, I think maybe actually this service may be better for what you're where you're at now. Okay, that's helpful. And would you say that in general, up to the point of maybe obsessing over nitty gritty tiny details of getting every word perfect, writers should be going as far as they can before they hand it over to an editor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Scanning through the questions here. So, what are good ways to keep from getting hypercritical of your own work when you receive a lot of feedback, both negative and positive? Because sometimes just having people, over analyze your own work makes you feel like you have to over analyze it as well. So, what are some ways to just keep sane and keep an objective, unflustered view of your story when you're working with others?
I can go. Yeah, I have a little system that I do when I get my first developmental edits back from my editor, because I always panic because my editor will and I'm talking about my editor when I send it off to my publisher, and they'll send me back a really nice letter that said, "Oh, this is great. We love it. And here are like 30 things you need to change." And I'm always like, I don't know, it's really overwhelming because, of course, like Irene said, you, as an author, you try and submit your absolute best writing that you can submit. And so you work really hard and you rewrite. And I'm a discovery writer, so I write. I kind of it's kind of more of a seat of the pants writer. So I do a lot of editing before it ever makes it out to my editor. I have to edit a lot myself, and so I do the editing, send it out, and then I have a lot to change. So I read it, I panic. I put it away for at least a day, sometimes several days, and start to calm down. And then I just start to go through and I kind of write out the small things I need to change. And then I kind of progressively go through and the bigger things I need to change. And then I can break it down. And by that time, I'm not panic anymore and I'm able to change it. Now, the other part of that question is, as far as if you get a lot of feedback, and especially if you're in a writer's group or online in a writer's group, and you get conflicting feedback, then I say, look at, what the majority says. If 8 people say you really need to change this and 2 people are like, oh, I kind of like it. Well, I would seriously, if these are readers that read in your genre and are readers that, offer constructive criticism and aren't just trying to tear you down as a writer. But if they're good at what they do, I would seriously consider it. But if it's half and half, then go with your gut. You're the author. I mean, always come back. And if there's something that you feel really strongly about, and your editor at your publishing house is okay with it, then I say go with whatever you feel strongest about.
I was thinking about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. When they were in the Inklings together, Lewis was the sort of writer that because the Inklings would just tear into each other in terms of their writing. I mean, they were merciless. And Lewis would take a look, and if it was a chapter that he'd read to them and they had a response, he'd go, okay, make those notes. I'll go back. I'll see if I can correct that or if I agree to correct it or whatever. But Tolkien would take any criticism and have to rewrite the whole book. I mean, he would just go back and wouldn't just be, I'll fix this chapter. He would second guess the whole thing. All I could think was that he was just neurotic in terms of any little thing. For me, at that point of revision, when I get anything, I actually did a short novel once, and I think the editor's notes were word count longer than the novel was. And but for me, at that point, I'm in fix-it mode. There's a sort of detachment that happens for me at that point, because usually there's that gap of time where I've let it go, and I've probably actually moved on. In the way my life works, I've probably moved on to another project or moved on to something, and then it comes back from the editor, and for me, it's okay. I got to go through this, and I got to figure out how to fix it. In fact, I find it almost energizing because it's a bit almost more concrete than it is the creating it to begin with. Do you know what I mean? Concrete in the sense that it is there. It is what it is. Now I'm getting the notes. And and now I need to just fix the thing. And I have that distance now to look at it a little more like I think the reader, anticipating what the reader is going to be thinking anyway, which I do the whole time I'm writing. I turn the editor off enough to be able to write in the first place, my internal editor. But I'm always thinking in terms of the reader, because number one, I assume the reader's smarter than I am, and that whatever it is that I'm doing, they're probably outguessing me, so I better be better and still surprising them in whatever I'm trying to do. But when I get down to that, the fix-it mode for me is, I don't want to say it's easier. It's still challenging because obviously the notes can create some degree of restructuring, rethinking characters, whatever it may be. But somehow when I get into fix-it mode, it's a different energy. And I don't go into some deep depression or anything unless it's a matter of time. I have to have this done by Friday, and so I'm a little bit stressed about getting it all done so that it's what it needs to be. But yeah, fix it mode actually is a different sort of fun for me.
And I think too, I think it's all a matter of who you trust, who the voices are that you're listening to. Like Tolkien and Lewis, like Paul mentioned, they trusted each other. They were iron sharpening iron consistently. And so you think you have to find those voices in your own life as a writer who you can trust. And who, my editor, Tyndale House, is my primary publisher. And my editors and I have different perspectives, but I trust them so much. So when I get their input, I may panic, but I want to make their changes because I know it's going to make the story better. Where sometimes when you send it out to a broad list, people who like different genres, or maybe just people who, for various reasons, why you may get feedback back that you do need to ignore. So I think my advice is just find those voices you can trust and people that you can really rely on to find and make those great changes.
Yeah, that's so true. You need to have people you trust deeply.
My hope when I return an edit to an author is, first of all, that they'll go through and they'll read the positive. I do a write-up. So there's a whole section of, hey, these are the things that are absolutely wonderful. And then I go through and talk about things that could be improved. So I always want them to know that it's not a matter of personally disliking anything. Everything that an editor tells you should be from the standpoint of this could be improved. You make that final choice, but like Melanie was saying, the person that you're getting your feedback from hopefully is somebody who's going to guide you in a good direction. So take the feedback as feedback and hopefully not, I know it's critical, but not a personal challenge to you. It is.
Well, yeah, and that's true, isn't it? I mean, the truth is, unless somebody's attacking us personally and you can tell they're attacking us personally, which we usually know the difference, as writers, we sort of can't, as personal as we take everything that we do, we can't take it personally. That's the thing about the revision, especially the revision stage. If honestly, if you're a writer and you're taking things personally, you might want to rethink your vocation. Because you're laying things out there. Anytime we take what's in here, put it into words or whatever, and it goes out, it's out of our hands. It is the done deal. You are open game for whatever the response is going to be. And some may attack you personally. Some may mean well, but still use words that are inflammatory and feel like they're personal. But honestly, the one thing I learned very early on was not to take anything personally. That's the difference between me and the thing that I've created. And the thing I've created is over here. And people can come after that and critique it and do what they're going to do. And even though I've invested myself and I wanted it to be good, there's a part of myself that has to detach. If I don't detach, I've been doing this for 40 years and I would not be doing it for 40 years. Nobody can sustain that level of attack for every project that they put out there. So That's valuable. Don't take anything personally. Assume goodwill is what I try to do.
That's good advice. So I have a question here that's I would say specifically for Irene, but also the rest of you can chime in. The question is, when we send out our book to beta readers and such, there's a lot of information they might want to know. And how do we differentiate between the information that they need to know and the information that is just tantalizing them and is good for them to not know until later?
So are you asking at what point to put the material into the book?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a good question or a good way to put it. At what point do we put the material into the book? How do we tell what is just someone being eager for a plot reveal and what is someone actually needing information to make sense of the book?
Right. It's probably a little bit of finesse because, we can sit here and say, don't put anything in your book that's not necessary. But then you have to decide what's necessary. So what you don't want is to be adding things in that ultimately had nothing to do with the rest of it. So I think my best advice is if you can hold off on something to build suspense, then that's great. If you can trickle backwards in the story and add a couple of things that later are going to mesh together with everything, then you can subtly put those things in initially without going on and on about them, and just create what's going to come together at the end. Just kind of gradually adding in the things that you're going to see later that were significant later, but don't add something in earlier that's not going to make any difference.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in, or we can move on to the next question?
Well, my quick thing would be, I always feel like writing's like playing Uno. You kind of have your cards and you're trying to figure out what you're going to play to the greatest advantage. That we have information that's vital, that people are going to get confused if you don't give enough of that early on. But it is kind of this sleight of hand. It's that thing like, anytime you're telling a good story, what do they essentially need to know so they're not going to be confused? But what do you hold back so that you can play that card for the greatest impact? You can bring that into the story as a matter. And I've done that. I've actually sort of revealed something about a character, like I'm working on something, and I reveal something and realize they don't need that now. In fact, it serves a greater impact if I move that later, and it won't confuse them for me to move that later. In fact, it builds tension. It builds the right kind of question mark about the character, because sometimes there's the suspense rather than confusion, which is, I'm not quite sure why they did that. Well, then you find out 3 chapters later, there's something deep going on from their background or for something else that led them to do something. But it's got to be played in a way that isn't going to cause the wrong kind of confusion. The right kind of confusion is suspense, basically, meaning I don't know what's going on, but I'm counting on the writer to explain this to me. And there's an expectation, I think, from the reader that says, and by the way, when you explain it to me, it better be really good. You shouldn't be dragging me along with something that isn't really good. So that's my view.
And I can take that question in 2 different ways, Deus, as far as like when I send out a manuscript. Was it to send out a manuscript to first readers? Was that the original question?
Well, I think it's first readers and beta readers.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you can do a little bit of teaser copy, like a back cover copy would do. Like I have a book coming out about a little girl that goes missing in the Thousand Islands of New York, and just kind of give like, this is kind of what's going to happen in the story. Maybe just give a couple of sentences like you would a teaser on Amazon or teaser on a back cover copy, just so they know the direction, or this is the genre, it's historical fiction or time slip or suspense or something like that. So they have a little bit of expectation of what's to come. But I wouldn't tell them very much about the story before you actually launch into the book. Maybe just a little bit of teaser copy. And then what both Paul and Irene have already talked about in regard to sort of the information dumping up front. I definitely would jump right into a scene, get the story going. Don't put too much information actually in the copy of the book. The way I look at it is, if I meet somebody for the first time and I'm like, hi, I'm Melanie, and they introduce themselves and then spend 5 minutes telling me their life story, I'm going to feel really overwhelmed to be like, okay, I need to go. I need to go get something to drink or whatever. It just feels super overwhelming if there's not this back and forth dialogue when you meet somebody. But once you get to know somebody's story, and this is how I look at it in our novels as well, once you get to know somebody's story, as time goes by, you start saying, well, why did they make that choice? And why did this? You kind of want to know their backstory. And so then as the story progresses, instead of putting all the backstory and the information dump at the beginning, as the story progresses, your readers are really going to want to know why your characters are making certain choices and the story behind the story. And then as the book goes on, you can put that information, the backstory, so to speak, later on in the book.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. So some of our attendees today are asking, how does one find a good editor to work with? So obviously you can just go find Irene and work with her, but if she's overbooked or for some other reason you can't work with her, how do you just go around about finding the right editor for you?
There are two organizations that I can refer you to. One is Christian Editor Connection. These are editors that have been vetted and they have been tested, and they are part of that group. That is christianeditor.com. So there's a form you can fill out to request an editor, and then they will match you up with an editor that can do what it is that you need done. Another option that I can throw out there is the Christian Pen. I'm going to have to look up that. I'm just trying to find the URL for you. That's the Christian Proofreaders and Editors Network. Yep, there it is. The THE Christian Pen, PEN.com. And then you can click on the Find an Editor link. And there are various lists that you can go through. Gold members, silver members, you can look through there. The gold members, they're listed with, like, they get their little write-up for each one. The silver members, I don't recall if they're doing the listing that way now for them as well. They're listed by what they offer. So then they'll say for copy editing fiction, they'll have a list of people. Most of the people on there will have a link to their websites. The people on the Christian Editor Connection doesn't list the editors, but they will connect you with the ones that will match up with what it is that you need. So that's where I would send people if I was fully booked. That's where I would send people.
Great. Thank you. All right. So we have a question here specifically for Paul, since you have worked on Adventures in Odyssey and in some of these settings where you're really working with a team, not just by yourself. So what is it like what do you like and dislike about that aspect? And are there any recommendations you might have for anybody who's interested, for instance, in co-writing a book or some of those more collaborative writing styles?
That's a very good question. The working in a team dynamic, it's interesting because more often than not in a team dynamic, everybody's been hired separately. Nobody was sitting down necessarily. You were hired to get the job done. And so you have often wide variety of personalities mixing together. But what brings you together is the singular goal of the show that you're working on and an understanding of what the show is and the characters in the show and that sort of thing. So in a sense, my entire writing life, even before I ever worked on Odyssey, I've always had people who were, forgive the expression, looking over my shoulder. So when I was writing dramas for my church, well, there was the minister of music. There were people who worked with me on that, and they were reading, and they were more or less approving or disapproving or making suggestions or whatever, again, to represent the audience. Oh, this is going to really upset people. You can't do that sketch, or this drama. I've always been surrounded by other voices. I've never been in a position where, in fact, I wouldn't even trust being in a position where I had singular and total control over whatever I was writing. I'm always looking for the other people to catch what I'm not catching, to see what I'm not seeing. But in the case of an Adventures in Odyssey situation, you have the common goal that you're working towards, but you also begin to learn, especially if it's a first experience, the difference between the constructive criticism, the legitimate sort of, but the character wouldn't say that. And then you have sometimes rigorous discussions about what the character's saying and doing. And other times, there were times when we realized, well, if you were writing this show, that's how you would do it. But I'm writing the show, and this is how I'm doing it. So I'm not betraying anything, or he's not betraying anything by what's being done. There's no betrayal of standards and practices, for example, that we're going completely off the canon of the program. And you just learn to do that. You go back and forth, and sometimes you can get into all kinds of fascinating arguments, which we sometimes did, theological or the deeper meaning of the show. Now, when you're dealing with a collaborator, I mean, you're making that choice. And it really is, it's like thinking about going on vacation with somebody. Not even your best friend may not be a good traveling companion. And sometimes you don't even know that until you've traveled 1,000 miles with them, and then you realize this may destroy our friendship. I don't collaborate in that sense. I don't co-write much, or very often. I'm the guy that does not play well with others. Maybe, I'm not sure. You have to ask other people that question. But in the cases where I did a couple of books with Dr. Walt Larimore. And he was writing, a doctor who writes, and I was writing, and I had this idea, and I knew I couldn't do the medical side of it. But I trusted that we had the right understanding between us about how decisions would be made, and then what would happen if we collided on something, who was going to be the arbitrator if we needed one, or did I have the final word because I was the more experienced writer. And then when we did have an editor, then we both sort of agreed that we trusted the editor to be the one to help us make the call. But you do want to be careful, because the whole act of writing is a kind of intimacy, and you need a kind of one-mindedness. Otherwise, you could be in for a battle almost all the way through, which some good things can come out of that tension. But I don't know that anybody enjoys living in that tension the whole time you're trying to write a book.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we have time for just a couple more questions, so I'm going to try to pick some of the juiciest ones. I think this one is really personal to a lot of people. We've talked a bit about not taking criticism too personally, but there's a conflict there because we do want to make our writing very personal in some ways because we're investing a lot of ourselves into it. So while not taking our writing, critique of our writing too personally, how do we still, bleed our hearts out into the story in some ways?
I think the goal, giving advice for revision, is to help you, for one. But the goal is to help you make the story better. So taking someone's advice on how to improve, I think the not taking it personally part is that our goals are for the story, and for the writer's development. So you can take that advice, take part of that advice, and make your decisions, but you're still writing it your way. It's just that if someone says, you might want to add this type of aspect to this character to make them more believable, then you still do it the way that you would do it. And at the same time, you're taking that advice. So I hope that makes sense. It's not intended to criticize you so much as to help you make the book better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But I would just jump in and say that writing is such a strange thing anyway. And we are basically investing ourselves so deeply in a very personal way into this. It's craft, it's intuition, it's everything in a sense that we're pouring into this. And yet it's almost like raising someone else's child. We have to have this weird detachment where we invest ourselves in, but there's a point where you have to let go. And it is whatever it is, there's the point when you let go, unless you are a writer. And I know some who rewrite, and what they're writing may never see the light of day, because they're scared or whatever. And those are legitimate feelings. But it's such a strange thing that we do, because it's both realities. We have to, unless we're just strictly commercial writers, but most commercial writers I know invest themselves. They're bringing the best that they can to whatever it is that they're writing within certain parameters. But that's the strange thing about what we do. It's all part and parcel to investing ourselves into it, but detaching enough to let it go. And both realities are concurrent to a great degree. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's the reality. I don't know how else to describe it.
And sometimes it's fun just to go online and there's a book, I think it's just called Rotten Reviews. I'd have to look up the title, but to go online and just see some of the greats, from Rudyard Kipling to Jane Eyre and all of these different books and authors, J.K. Rowling, and just read some of their reviews. And some, people aren't always kind, and it's not a profession for the faint of heart. But I would just encourage you, write what God's called you to write, pour it on paper, find some trustworthy people, other readers, to be able to come in and critique and help you make the strongest story that you can write. But it's still your story. It is still your story to tell, and you need to be able to write and get it out there. But yeah, you can encourage yourself by looking and seeing what other people have, how they've reviewed some of the other people, and it makes you feel a little bit better, because people just, not everybody's going to love what you write. And I think going into it with that approach of, you are going to get, you are going to have people that critique. They're going to offer some really hard critiques, especially on Amazon, places like that, where they give really hard reviews. But you have to be faithful to write what God's called you to write, no matter the feedback that you get.
And if there's any consolation in this, I found this magazine written in the 1800s. And it was a review of a couple of books. One of them was Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And the review lacerated Huckleberry Finn, lacerated Mark Twain, lacerated it as an unworthy book. Don't even bother reading it. Whereas this other book was a perfect example of what a book should be and what a great story is and all of this. And I can't even remember the name of the other book. and nobody else in history knows what the other book is because it just disappeared. So for all the good reviews and the bad reviews, we see also, because Twain stayed true to what it was he was trying to do at great risk and at great cost to some degree, history is borne out, which is the stronger book.
That's great. So we have time for one last question. I'm going to pick this one, which is, how do you keep your voice when editors or peers give feedback, especially if they're giving their own suggestions?
Go ahead, Melanie.
Thanks, Paul. I don't know that I ever get feedback on voice. It's, the voice is so part of what you write that it's just incorporated in everything. And if somebody doesn't like my voice, so to speak, they're probably not the right reader to be, critiquing my work. Now, there might be some lines that they don't understand or you're not communicating. I mean, so, a lot of times I'll think, I'm communicating it so they can easily understand it. And somebody's like, I don't understand at all what that means. I have a really great reader friend who is a local psychology professor, and she's great. And she thinks really visually, and she's like, you're saying this, but this is not how it's coming across, So that's good to have that sort of feedback. But if somebody doesn't like the way that you're communicating your story, my suggestion would be perhaps it'd be better to have somebody else read and critique your book. I don't know if that answers your question exactly. The voice is just it's just threaded through who you are, and as a writer, this is how you communicate. At least this is how it is for me.
Well, voice is inexplicable to me because the whole question of how do you find your voice is fascinating. Because for me, as soon as a writer stops trying to pretend like he or she's being other writers, as soon as they stop imitating and parroting, their voice emerges. After all these years, my people who know my writing know my voice better than I do, because it just is. It is what it is. At the point when I stopped trying to write like somebody else, then it emerged. But when I'm writing, I'm usually writing through the perspective of a character. Now, I admire Neil Gaiman and other writers like that who reclaimed the role of the storyteller, creating a voice, like C.S. Lewis did in Narnia, for example. And then we went through this phase of objective writing where the voice was almost supposed to be neutral and not a character, because it's not a character. It's this sort of third person God out there. But if I'm writing as a character, I think my voice is creeping in, whether I mean for it to or not, because of the choices and the style and the way I'm phrasing things. And yet I'm hoping the reader's getting the character. I'm writing first person. Or if the third person narrator has enough interest in the narrative and in the prose that it's engaging them. It's good writing, the way writing should be anyway. But my choices and decision making lead into, I guess, what makes my voice. It's a fascinating thing to me. But I'm with you. If they don't care for the character, or if for some reason you're a hard-boiled detective and they find that offensive, well, maybe they're reading the wrong genre, or they're reading the wrong kind of. They want Agatha Christie and not, Raymond Chandler. It's that sort of thing, I think.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. And Irene, do you want to just wrap us up talking a bit about how you as an editor interact with an author's voice, and how do you try to keep that, especially when you're doing some more nitty-gritty line or copy edits, and what are ways that authors can interact with an editor and still try to keep their voice?
Paul made a really good point that authors are going to have kind of the way that they write, the way that they phrase things. Do they use more similes than others? Do they like the metaphors? And those things come across. When you are learning techniques and you're, for example, point of view, POV, are you slipping into someone else's mind for a minute versus the character that's the POV for the scene? So editors can help you refine the skills, but you're still, I think once your skills get to a point where you're not making as many errors of fiction techniques, you're not going on and on with purple prose or whatever, then I think your voice comes through a lot clearer because you're ironing out the things that would interfere with it. So when you make some changes, you're still you, and the way that you do things, although the technique might change a little bit, who you are as a writer is still coming through as your voice.
Mm. Yeah, so working with an editor actually could help you improve your voice because it's improving, just polishing your writing overall.
Mhm.
That's
Oh, and a
good
very
point.
quick point on that. I remember a very early thing that I wrote, and the editor just tore into it in the right way in terms of making corrections. And I kept going, yeah, but that's not how I would say it. But then I realized, but it was bad writing. I may have been true to my voice, but my voice was obviously not a very good writer. And then I realized maybe I should be thinking more about dialogue in terms of characters as opposed to what makes good writing, as in terms of prose and such. And we do need to make sure we understand the difference. Our voice is no excuse for bad writing.
Thanks for sharing that. So that's been a great panel discussion. And thank you, everyone, so much for your wonderful questions. I feel like we were really able to address a lot of aspects of revisions in general, and specifically writing along with the others who come along with us for this journey, the editors, the critique partners, and everyone else who helps with the story. So we still got, I believe, 2 more sessions to go tonight. So get a good meal in, maybe some coffee to stay awake, and stay tuned for that. Also, make sure not to forget to check out the special page we have on the summit for the company and the special offer they have just for those attending this summit. And I want to once again thank each of you, Paul, Irene, and Melanie. Thank you so much. You really expressed yourselves very well and hit the nail on a lot of these questions, and brought a lot of good stories, which I always love to hear from your own lives, to really spice this session up. So thank you once again. I've really enjoyed having you here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
Great to be here.
God bless.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So